The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song as Margaret Walsh pushed through the emergency entrance at Seattle General, her silver hair pulled back so tight it seemed to erase her face. The night shift stretched ahead, 12 hours in a hospital that had become her entire world, a place where she could disappear into precision and routine. She moved through the corridors like a ghost, her footsteps nearly silent on the tile, her scrubs a faded blue that had seen better years. Nobody looked at her. That was exactly how she preferred it. The antiseptic smell hit first, that harsh, clean hospital scent mixed with something underneath it, something organic and desperate that no amount of bleach could remove. She clocked in at 23 minutes after 11, her movements economical and certain. The charge nurse glanced up from the assignment board, barely registering her presence before returning to whatever crisis was unfolding on the third floor. Margaret collected her patient list without commentary and made her way to the medication dispensary, her hand steady as surgical lasers as she counted out medications for the night. Morphine. Lorazepam. Vancomycin. Each dose exact, each movement practiced so many times that muscle memory had become reflex. In room 447, James Chen lay propped against a stack of pillows, his right leg amputated below the knee, his breathing labored and shallow. He'd been a Marine, Delta Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse, until an IED took his leg in Sanjin Valley 14 months ago. Now he waited for the hospital to remember him, for the doctors to stop by with their clipboards and their half-smiles and their promises of better days. The pain in his chest had started 2 hours ago, a tightness he couldn't explain, a pressure that made each breath feel like drowning. He'd called the nurse station 3 times. Nobody had come. When Margaret entered his room at 0347, she took in the scene in 2 seconds, the slight blue tint at his lips, the way his nostrils flared with each breath, the shallow rise and fall of his chest. She didn't ask how he was feeling. She moved to his bedside and placed her hands on his rib cage, feeling the pneumothorax before the machines could confirm it. The collapsed lung was obvious to someone who knew how to look. Her fingers found the second intercostal space with the precision of muscle memory, and she was already moving, already reaching for the equipment, her movement so fluid and decisive that James Chen's eyes widened. "Needle," she said, her voice clipped and professional. "I can wait for," James began, but Margaret was already drawing up the anesthesia with one hand while preparing the site with the other. The catheter went in with a soft hiss, and the air that had been trapped in his chest cavity escaped with an audible rush. Immediate relief flooded his face. His breathing eased. His color improved. Within seconds, his oxygen saturation climbed from 84 to 91. The machine beeped its approval. Jane stared at her hands, scarred, competent, moving with the terrifying precision of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Not in a hospital classroom. Not from a textbook. This was something else entirely. This was the kind of skill that came from making life or death decisions under fire, from holding people together when they were falling apart. "You were a combat medic," he whispered, not asking. Margaret met his eyes for one long moment, and in that silence was everything: confirmation, recognition, acknowledgement. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her hands told the story. The way she'd assessed his condition. The speed with which she'd moved. The fact that she'd known exactly what to do before the monitors had even screamed the diagnosis. She'd been somewhere that required these skills. Somewhere that required this kind of competence under pressure. She taped the catheter in place with movement so economical they bordered on artistic, then stepped back and checked his oxygen levels one more time. 94%. Sinus rhythm. His blood pressure stabilizing. She adjusted his foredrip and wrote her notes in his chart, precise, clinical, nothing extra. Then she turned to leave, and James caught her wrist. "Thank you," he said. "I've never seen anyone move like that before." Margaret paused at the door, her hand still resting on the frame. "Get some rest, Marine. Your body's been through enough." She didn't look back as she walked out, didn't see the way he stared after her, finally understanding that he'd just been saved by someone extraordinary masquerading as ordinary. Dr. Pierce arrived for morning rounds at 0603, his shoes expensive and polished, his voice carrying the kind of arrogance that came from generational wealth and an Ivy League medical degree. He had dark hair slicked back with something that smelled like money, and his stethoscope hung around his neck like a medal. He swept into the unit with an entourage of 3 residents, all of them scrambling to match his pace, all of them holding tablets and trying to look essential. He didn't see Margaret at first. She was checking vitals in room for 51, her movements quiet and efficient, her presence barely registering on the landscape of the hospital. She was the kind of person the institution was designed to ignore, a night shift nurse with silver hair, moving through corridors like she'd earned the right to be invisible. Dr. Pierce saw her only when she stepped into the hallway with a patient chart, and when their eyes met for a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Recognition that she was there. Recognition that she'd accomplished something in his domain without asking his permission. "How was the code in 447? He asked one of his residents, his voice casual but his eyes still on Margaret as she documented her notes. "Wasn't a code," one of the residents stammered. "Patient had a pneumothorax. Night nurse decompressed it before we even called." Dr. Pierce's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd been at Seattle General for 4 years, and in that time he'd established himself as the kind of physician who needed to be the authority in every room, the one with the answer, the one who mattered. A night shift nurse performing a high-level intervention without waiting for physician clearance was a breach of that carefully maintained hierarchy. It was competence he couldn't control, and competence he couldn't control was dangerous to men like him. He watched Margaret move through the corridor, noting the way her scrubs hung on a frame that suggested someone who'd lived through something harder than most hospital work demanded. He saw the slight limp in her left leg, an old injury, probably, and the way her hands never trembled as she worked. Steady hands. Knowledgeable hands. Hands that suggested a level of experience that shouldn't exist in someone her age, someone working the night shift, someone who looked like she'd been left behind by the profession. By the time Dr. Pierce finished his rounds, Margaret was already charting her notes in the break room, a cold cup of hospital coffee sitting untouched beside her keyboard. He stationed himself in the doorway, watching her work, and she knew exactly who was there without looking up. "I appreciate the initiative in 447, he said, his voice carrying a tone that suggested the opposite. "But in the future, we follow protocol. You notify the on-call physician before performing invasive procedures. Are we clear?" Margaret finished typing her note, then looked up at him with the kind of composure that made younger people uncomfortable. The patient was in respiratory failure. Protocol required immediate intervention. "I understand," Dr. Pierce said, moving further into the room, "but we have a chain of command for a reason. Some people, experienced people, should handle these situations. Not everyone has the judgment." The implication hung in the air like humidity. He was laying the groundwork, establishing the narrative. He was good at this. By evening, the whispers would start. By the end of the week, half the hospital would have heard that Margaret Walsh had lost her license in some previous position, that she'd been let go from a facility back east, that her judgment was questionable. The residents would hear it from the interns. The nurses would hear it from the doctors. The narrative would solidify until it became truth. Margaret simply nodded once. "Understood, doctor." She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. She didn't remind him that she'd just saved a patient's life, that her initiative had made the difference between James Chen living and dying in the next 12 minutes. She simply accepted the rebuke and returned to her charting, her hands as steady as they'd ever been, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light. Dr. Pierce stood there for a moment longer, frustrated by her lack of reaction, by the way she'd acknowledged his authority without acknowledging his right to question hers. Then he left, already making mental notes about which residents might be receptive to suggestions about the old nurse on the night shift. When she thought no one was watching, Margaret's left hand moved to her jacket hanging in the locker, a hammer-down piece of hospital standard that she'd worn for 3 years. Her fingers found the inside lining, locating the faded patch sewn there, the emblem of the 75th Ranger Regiment hidden where no one would ever see it. She pressed her palm against it once, a gesture of connection to a life she was no longer allowed to acknowledge. Captain Margaret Walsh had been erased from the Pentagon's records 5 years ago, buried under classification stamps and executive orders, her service rendered into a ghost story that existed nowhere in the official record. Now she was just Margaret the night nurse, the one with the silver hair and the uncertain background, the one who pushed meds and changed dressings and apparently thought she could perform advanced medical procedures without asking permission. Dr. Pierce had just made a significant mistake. He'd identified Margaret as a threat to his authority, and he'd decided to destroy her quietly, systematically, using whispers and innuendo and the kind of institutional power that usually worked on people without her particular skill set. What he didn't know was that Margaret had spent the last 5 years learning how to disappear so thoroughly that the entire United States military had declared her a classified asset. She understood institutional power in ways that terrified bureaucrats and generals. She'd been invisible by design in places far more dangerous than Denver. The question wasn't whether she could survive Dr. Pierce's campaign of destruction. The question was what he'd do when he realized exactly who he was trying to erase. Dr. Pierce entered the Grand Rounds auditorium at 0800 on a Tuesday, Margaret's chart held like a scalpel in his right hand. 30 medical students sat in descending rows, their attention clicking toward him the way predators turn their heads at movement. He didn't glance at Margaret standing in the back row near the fluorescent lights, her silver hair catching the hum of electricity above. He didn't need to. She was already his audience. "Here we have what I call the Florence Nightingale problem," Pierce announced, his voice the precise timbre of condescension, each word weighted to land. He held the chart open, turned it toward the students. Nurses who believe their experience substitutes for actual medical education. He tapped Margaret's handwriting with one manicured finger. "Ms. Walsh here recommended we check for compartment syndrome in a post-op patient." Apparently unaware that I had already ruled it out during my examination. Laughter rippled through the students, not cruel yet, just the nervous tittering of hierarchy being performed. Pierce smiled the way a conductor smiles when the orchestra finally finds the rhythm. "The danger of the echo chamber," he continued, "is when staff members with limited training begin to believe they understand pathophysiology." He turned a page. "Ms. Walsh's notes demonstrate what happens when experience masquerades as expertise. A cautionary tale, if you will, about the limitations of bedside intuition." Margaret's jaw tightened. 1 millimeter. A movement so slight that only someone trained to read human bodies in crisis would catch it. She kept her hands clasped in front of her scrubs, her breathing unchanged, her face a blank canvas where nothing lived. But inside was different. Inside was 18 years of watching people die because doctors wouldn't listen to the people who spent 24 hours with them while physicians spent 20 minutes. Inside was the weight of a decision made on a mountain in Kandahar where the colonel had ordered her to listen to his assessment over her own clinical judgment, and the patient had died at 0347 because of it. She'd gotten good at keeping inside and outside separate. She'd had no choice. Pierce dismissed the chart and moved to the next case. But the seed had been planted. Margaret watched it grow in real time, the way the students' eyes shifted when they passed her in the hallway, the way residents no longer asked her clinical opinions during night shift, the way her notes began appearing in teaching rounds as examples of what not to do. The whispers started as rumors and became doctrine. Margaret Walsh was outdated. Margaret Walsh didn't understand modern medicine. Margaret Walsh was the kind of nurse you smiled at politely but never actually listened to. 2 days later, by the vending machines on the 3rd floor, 2 residents performed for an audience of 3 interns. Margaret was feeding quarters into the machine, methodical, deliberate, 1 coin at a time, when she heard her own name said as a punchline. "Did you hear Granny Walsh tried to correct Pierce's sepsis protocol?" One resident laughed, his voice loud enough to carry, loud enough to be heard. His companion's laughter answered him like a call and response. "The old woman thinks she's playing doctor. Someone should tell her the nursing home is across the street." The interns giggled nervously. Margaret's hands continued their work. Quarter. Slot. Quarter. Slot. Her fingers were steady as surgical instruments, each movement precise, no tremor, no hesitation. The vending machine accepted her money without judgment. The potato chips fell into the collection bin with a soft crinkle. She collected them and turned to leave, and her eyes passed directly over the resident's face without acknowledgement, not angry, not wounded, not even hurt. Blank. Empty. The way someone might look at a wall. It was worse than any response they'd expected. Pierce heard about the vending machine incident by lunch. He also heard that Margaret had stood silent, unashamed, and simply walked away. That kind of dignity under mockery was dangerous. It suggested she had something the residents lacked, a center of gravity that their laughter couldn't disturb. He decided to move faster. The following week, during rounds on the third floor, Margaret noticed something in Dr. Pierce's orders for the disabled veteran in room 447. James Chen, former Army medic, had been flagged for attention-seeking behavior after he'd asked for pain assessment 4 times in 6 hours. Pierce's note was categorical: patient's complaints inconsistent with presentation. Likely drug-seeking. Recommend minimal intervention for behavioral symptoms. Margaret read the chart outside Chen's door and felt something cold move through her chest. She'd learned to recognize the tone of dismissal, the specific phrase construction that meant a doctor had stopped listening, that everything the patient said after would be filtered through the lens of drug seeker, malingerer, attention seeker. It was the vocabulary of people who'd never spent a night shift holding a man's hand while he tried not to scream from pain he wasn't supposed to have. She waited until rounds ended, until Pierce had moved to the next floor, and then she walked into the consult area where Dr. Pierce was dictating notes into a digital recorder. Her voice was quiet, careful, the voice she'd perfected over years of speaking to people in positions of power. Dr. Pierce, I wanted to clarify something about Mr. Chen's antibiotic protocol for his potential pneumonia. She held a folder with his chart, her posture deferential, her tone absolutely professional. His temperature is trending up, and his left lower lobe sounds diminished. I was thinking we might want to consider a broader spectrum coverage. Absolutely not. Pierce didn't look up from his recorder. His temp is 99.8. That's not pneumonia. That's the body's normal inflammatory response to surgery. His left lobe sounds. I have examined the patient. I have ordered imaging. I have made my assessment. He finally turned to face her, and his voice shifted into something harder. And I have had enough of your interference. The words traveled down the hallway like a shockwave. Nurses froze mid-step. A resident stopped walking. The space between Margaret and Pierce became a stage. Question my protocols again, Pierce continued, his voice echo chamber loud, and I will have security escort you out of this hospital. Do you understand me, or do I need to use smaller words? Margaret nodded once. A single acknowledgement of his authority. Her face remained carved from something harder than stone, from the kind of composure that comes from standing in worse places and maintaining discipline when everything inside is screaming. She held his eyes for exactly 1 second, then turned and walked back toward the patient charts without a word. But her hands, only her hands, betrayed her. They shook for exactly 12 seconds as she arranged the charts on the desk. Not a tremor you could see from a distance, but the kind of minute vibration that comes from muscles held too tight, from power compressed into stillness. She made fists. Opened them. Made fists again. 12 seconds. Then they went stone steady and stayed that way, filing charts with mechanical precision while her colleagues pretended they hadn't heard the threat, hadn't seen the reprimand, hadn't watched the most senior nurse on the night shift get dressed down like a student who'd forgotten to wash her hands. That night, alone in the supply closet on the 3rd floor, Margaret pressed her forehead against the cold metal shelving. The air in the closet smelled of antiseptic and cardboard, the scent like hospital distilled into its purest form. Her breathing came hard, then controlled, then steady. This was the part nobody taught you in anatomy, how to compress years of trauma into the space beneath your ribs, how to keep it from leaking out when someone in a white coat decided you didn't matter. She'd done it before in the mountains. She'd done it in the processing facility when they'd classified her file, erased her name, told her that Captain Margaret Walsh had never existed and never would exist in any official record. She could do it in a supply closet in Denver. The question was what would happen when she couldn't anymore. The afternoon shift had been running smooth when James Chen started asking for pain medication around 3 o'clock. His bed was in the northwest corner of the unit, where the afternoon sun hit the windows hard enough to make the machines cast long shadows. He pressed the call button and asked the nurse about chest discomfort. Nothing dramatic, just a dull pressure behind his sternum, radiating down his left arm. The nurse noted it, documented it, then made the mistake of mentioning it to Dr. Pierce during rounds. Pierce was standing at the computer terminal, his Rolex catching the fluorescent light as he scrolled through charts. When he heard about Chen's complaint, his jaw tightened just slightly. Attention-seeking behavior, Pierce said, loud enough for the junior residents to hear. Disabled patients often develop phantom symptoms to maintain attention from staff. Note it. But no additional pain management. If he continues complaining, that becomes a behavioral issue, not a medical one. The residents nodded. Took notes. One of them actually wrote attention-seeking directly in the chart. Within the hour, everyone on the day shift had received the message through that invisible hospital network, the one that moved faster than email, leave James Chen alone. By 5 o'clock, Chen stopped pressing the call button. He'd learned the lesson. You ask once, get dismissed, and then stop asking. It was a skill disabled people developed early, the instinct to become invisible rather than risk being labeled difficult. The evening nurse, a harried woman named Stephanie who was covering 2 units, glanced at him during her final rounds. You feeling okay? She asked, already moving toward the door. Chen nodded. Didn't mention the pressure anymore. The shift change happened at 7. The night staff arrived and settled in. Chen lay in his bed, the pressure in his chest gradually becoming something heavier than discomfort. Something that made his breathing shallower. Something that made him not want to move. By midnight, the pressure had transformed into something else entirely. His chest felt like someone was standing on it. His breathing came in short gasps. He'd been a rifleman with the 82nd Airborne before the IED took his legs. He knew his body, knew when something was catastrophically wrong. But he also knew that asking would only get him labeled as difficult. He lay in the dark and tried to breathe slowly. Tried to think through the panic that was creeping up his spine like cold water. By 0300, James Chen was drowning on dry land. Margaret arrived for her shift and moved through the quiet unit the way she always did, methodical, observing everything. Bed by bed. Vitals by vitals. She was passing room for 47 when she heard it, the sound that no nurse ever forgets. The wet, desperate breathing of someone whose lungs were drowning in their own collapse. She stopped. Turned. Looked at him. His lips had the blue tint of someone measuring their remaining seconds. His eyes were wide and panicked and his chest was heaving in a pattern that screamed tension pneumothorax. Complete lung collapse. Air trapped between lung and chest wall, pressure building with every breath, compressing his heart, cutting off his venous return. 3 minutes. Maybe 4 if he was lucky. Margaret hit the call button and spoke into the intercom, get respiratory to 447. Now. Code Blue protocol. Then she was moving, not running, which would cause panic, but moving with the kind of speed that came from muscle memory that had been burned into her neurons during 7 years of field medicine in Kandahar and forward operating bases where the triage line between life and death was measured in seconds instead of hours. She was already pulling on fresh gloves. Already assessing. The night shift nurse appeared in the doorway, a young man named Tyler who went pale the moment he saw Chen's color. He needs a chest tube, Margaret said. Now. Call Dr. Pierce for authorization on the needle decompression. Tyler fumbled for his phone. Waited. Margaret knew what was happening on the other end, Pierce being woken, being told that a disabled veteran needed an emergency procedure, probably checking the notes first, probably seeing the attention-seeking behavior and deciding that this was some kind of test. 30 seconds passed. 45. Chen's oxygen saturation was dropping, 78%. 72%. 68%. Dr. Pierce says. Tyler's voice was shaking. He says to monitor and reassess. He's not authorizing the procedure. He says this could be anxiety-related and... Margaret was already moving. She reached down to her right ankle, peeled back her scrub pants leg, and pulled the combat knife she'd carried for 12 years. The blade was old Damascus steel, sharpened weakly, its handle wrapped in paracord faded to grey. Tyler's eyes went enormous. "What are you doing?" His voice cracked like a teenage boy's. "Get betadine," Margaret said. Her voice had dropped an octave. It was no longer the tentative voice of Margaret the night nurse. It was the voice of Captain Margaret Walsh, who had held a field hospital together under fire in a place where the only rule was that people did not die on your watch. "Pour it over the blade. Then leave this room and document nothing. You can't, there's no authorization, there's a procedure, the hospital has protocols." Margaret turned and looked at him, and whatever he saw in her eyes made him stop talking. He grabbed the betadine bottle with shaking hands. Poured it over the blade in a careful stream that caught the overhead light. The knife blade glowed amber. Margaret took it, held it steady. "He dies in 3 minutes or I save him in 30 seconds, Margaret said. "Choose." Tyler chose. He fled. Margaret sterilized the insertion point on Chen's chest with a chlorhexidine pad, her hands absolutely steady now. She identified the anatomical landmarks by touch, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the same way she'd done it 247 times before, the same way she could do it in a sandstorm or a blackout or with a migraine that felt like someone was driving nails into her skull. She pressed the blade against his skin and made the incision with the kind of precision that came from having done it while being shot at. Air hissed out. The tension released. Chen gasped, a real, clear, unstopped breath. His oxygen saturation jumped immediately, 72 to 78 to 84. His eyes were locked on Margaret's hands as she worked, her movements economical and certain. She was already fashioning an improvised chest seal from a sterile dressing, already monitoring for any signs of recollapse. Chen's breathing steadied. Color started returning to his lips. "That's..." Chen's voice was hoarse. "Special Forces Field Protocol. You're not just a nurse." "No," Margaret said quietly. "I'm not." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the next bay over, could hear the rain starting to hammer the windows outside, could hear the distant hum of the elevator in the main corridor. Margaret was securing the dressing when the lights flickered, just once, and then the door to room for 47 exploded open hard enough to make both of them flinch. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway. He looked at the knife on the tray. He looked at the blood. He looked at Margaret's hands, which were steady as surgical lasers and clearly inside a patient's chest cavity without his authorization. His face went from flushed to bone white. "What have you done?" His voice was a shout that echoed down the corridor. Chen, breathing clearly now, actually breathing, looked at him and managed, "She saved my life." Pierce's hand was already moving to his phone. His fingers were shaking now with a kind of rage that came from losing control of a situation. He was dialing before he even looked away from Margaret. "You just ended your career," he said. His voice was quiet now. That was somehow worse than the shouting. "I'm calling administration. I'm calling the board. I'm calling the state nursing board. What you did tonight, the unauthorized procedure, the use of a weapon, the violation of hospital protocol, the insubordination," he paused, and his smile appeared like a shark breaking the surface. "This is going to destroy you." The rain kept hammering against the window behind him. Margaret didn't flinch. Didn't blink. She simply finished securing the dressing, stepped back, and looked at Pierce with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst thing that could happen to you. "Room for 47 is stabilized," she said. "I'll document the emergency procedure. You can inform the board whenever you're ready." It wasn't what he expected. He'd expected begging. Expected tears. Expected a desperate nurse trying to save her career. Instead he got a woman whose voice sounded like she was reading him the weather forecast. He stood there for 3 seconds, his phone halfway to his ear, his superiority crumbling against her absolute composure, and then he turned and walked out of the room. Behind him, James Chen was breathing freely for the first time in 12 hours, and Margaret was already checking his oxygen saturation one more time. Dr. Pierce arrived at 0400 with his phone already in his hand. The ICU corridors were empty except for Margaret, still bent over James Chen's chest, her fingers working the last sutures with a kind of precision that made residents weep in their applications. She didn't look up. She knew exactly who was standing in the doorway. The oxygen saturation had climbed to 94%. The crisis was over. Chen was breathing. Pierce's face went the color of old concrete. He turned on his heel and walked back down the corridor, and Margaret heard the first phone call begin before he'd even reached the stairwell. His voice carried through the quiet hospital like a blade through silk. "Board Chair Morrison. Yes, I know it's for in the morning. We have a credential emergency. A night shift nurse just performed an authorized invasive surgery using a combat knife. I'm not exaggerating. A knife. From her ankle holster. Yes, I'll hold." Margaret finished the last suture. She checked Chen's lung sounds bilaterally, clear air movement on both sides. She removed her gloves with a snap that echoed in the empty room and walked to the sink, where she scrubbed her hands until the water ran clear. The smell of betadine wouldn't leave her fingers for days. She knew that. She'd known it would happen. By 0530, the second call had gone out to the State Nursing Board investigator, and Pierce's voice in the administrator's office had taken on the tone of a man sharing devastating intelligence. Her previous employer was the VA system. I'd recommend calling them directly about her instability. Night shift paranoia. Delusions of combat expertise. She carries weapons to work. She's a liability waiting to happen. The investigator promised to look into her records, and Pierce smiled into his phone because her records, the ones from the Pentagon, the ones that confirmed everything, were sealed under executive order, classified so deep that even the VA only knew her as a nurse with a background check and a heartbeat. By 0600, 3 board members had received calls. By 0700, the first one called back. By 0900, Margaret stood in the administrator's office on the 14th floor, where the morning light came through floor-to-ceiling windows and showed Denver spreading below like a circuit board, and Dr. Pierce presented his case to Patricia Gaines, the hospital administrator, whose face had the particular expression of someone who'd been woken at 5 in the morning and had not yet recovered her ability to process chaos. "Unauthorized invasive procedure," Pierce said, reading from his phone. "Performed without physician authorization. Performed with an improvised weapon, a knife, retrieved from her person. Gross violation of sterile protocol. Gross violation of hospital policy regarding weapons in clinical settings. I have witnesses." 3 nurses saw her perform what can only be described as a street fight move on a patient's chest cavity. Margaret stood with her hands clasped behind her back, a posture from another lifetime, parade rest, the stance of soldiers waiting for judgment. Her face showed nothing. Not the tightness around her eyes that came from knowing what was about to happen. Not the small muscle that had learned not to flinch when authority arrived. She'd been ordered to disappear once before, and she'd obeyed. Authority was a language she understood. "Is this accurate, Ms. Walsh?" Gaines leaned back in her chair, which squeaked, an awful sound, like a small animal. "Did you perform a surgical procedure without authorization?" "I performed an emergency procedure on a patient in cardiac compromise," Margaret said. Her voice was level, a flat prairie with no hills. "Tension pneumothorax. He had 3 minutes before arrest. I used the equipment available. I stabilized him. He's alive." "She used a knife," Pierce interrupted. "A combat knife. This isn't wilderness medicine, it's a hospital with a full surgical suite downstairs." "The surgical suite was locked," Margaret said. "Still flat. Still nothing. The patient was in respiratory failure. The door code changed at 2300. I wasn't authorized for the new code. Pierce's jaw tightened. He'd been waiting for her to sound defensive, to sound desperate. Instead, she sounded like someone reciting facts. A witness. Not a suspect. Regardless, the procedure is unauthorized. Her credentials don't cover emergency surgical procedures. She's a floor nurse. Gaines rubbed her temples. The sunlight caught her wedding ring, threw a small rainbow across the desk. I'm going to have to suspend your nursing credentials pending investigation. This is protocol when weapons are involved. When unauthorized procedures are performed. I'm sorry, Margaret. I know you were trying to help the patient. I understand, Margaret said. You'll need to turn in your badge and scrubs. I understand. Pierce stood up. He'd wanted more of a response. He'd wanted anger, tears, the small breaking that would confirm his theory about her instability. Instead, she was turning away, already dismissing him, already returning to a patient she'd never see again. His jaw clenched like a fist. He followed her to the door. Why are you doing this? Margaret asked quietly. She wasn't asking about the suspension. They both knew that. Pierce smiled. The smile of a man who'd won a small battle and believed he'd won the war. Because people like you don't get to be heroes, he said. You follow orders or you leave. Medicine has hierarchies for a reason. You should have stayed invisible. The words landed like a photograph of a photograph, a reflection of a reflection, the Pentagon colonel's voice echoing through 5 years. You were never there. Captain Margaret Walsh never existed. Operation Graveyard is classified. You will disappear, and you will stay disappeared. It's not a request. She'd obeyed that order. 12 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment, 3 tours in Kandahar, 14 mass casualty events treated in an abandoned compound while mortars shook the walls, all of it folded away like classified documents. All of it locked in a storage unit in Aurora, Colorado, in a box that held a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star with Valor, a Silver Star that nobody at Seattle General knew she'd earned. She'd changed her hair. She'd taken a job that kept her in shadows. She'd learned to be invisible. And she'd obeyed until James Chen's oxygen saturation hit 68 and the choice became simple, follow orders or let someone die. She'd made her choice. Now she was living with it. That evening, Margaret returned to the hospital laundry room, where the fluorescent lights buzzed their perpetual song and the air tasted like industrial detergent and hot fabric. The smell of it was almost enough to make her forget the smell of betadine. Almost. She retrieved her scrubs from her locker, 5 sets of blue cotton, one with a small stain from Chen's blood that hadn't quite come out, and began to fold them. The first one took the longest. Her hands performed the task with muscle memory, the kind of precision that came from folding bandages on a Humvee tailgate at 0400, from folding body armor in the dust, from folding uniforms the day the Pentagon told her who she wasn't anymore. The fabric was soft from 100 washings. It still smelled faintly of betadine and the particular metallic scent of dried blood. She folded the second one faster. The third one. The fourth. By the fifth, her hands moved almost like they weren't attached to her body, like they belonged to someone else, someone who'd never been Captain Margaret Walsh and never would be again. She set the stack on the counter. Folded blue cotton, a nurse's colors, the uniform of invisibility. Her fingers lingered on the fabric for 5 full seconds, the longest goodbye. Then she walked out through the staff entrance, passed her employee badge through the return slot, and watched it disappear into the machine with a small mechanical whisper. The Denver morning hit her with a wall of dry air and early sun. The parking lot was already warming up, the asphalt releasing heat like a breath held too long. She'd expected to feel something in that moment, sadness, anger, the small relief of ending. Instead she felt nothing. She'd learned that feeling nothing was a skill, and she'd trained for years to perfect it. She walked toward the bus stop without looking back, and if anyone had been watching, they would have seen only a tired woman in civilian clothes, someone without importance, someone the world could forget. Behind her, Seattle General stood white and clean against the morning sky, full of people who didn't know that a legend had just walked out through their staff entrance. Full of people who believed their hierarchies and their protocols meant something. Full of people who hadn't yet learned that the quietest person in the room was sometimes the one holding everyone together. Dr. Pierce was still in the hospital, on the 8th floor, in a conference room with the board chair and 3 other administrators, celebrating the removal of someone he'd finally managed to destroy. He was explaining how he'd handled the situation with such finesse, how he'd protected the integrity of their medical program, how he'd removed a liability before she could cause real harm. Nobody in that room knew what he'd just done. Nobody had any idea yet. But James Chen was sleeping peacefully on the 4th floor with a chest tube in place and oxygen flowing and a heart rate of 62, and somewhere in Denver, a woman who'd been ordered to disappear was learning how to do it all over again. The ICU ward at Seattle General smelled like antiseptic and hope. James Chen had been moved there at 0600 that morning, his oxygen saturation climbing steadily, his chest tube draining dark fluid that meant his lung was re-expanding. The nurses monitored him in 4-hour rotations, and none of them knew that the woman who'd saved his life had been erased from the hospital entirely by the time he'd woken up. By 0800, a police escort arrived with a second patient, a man in his 40s with shrapnel wounds embedded in his abdomen and left shoulder, his paperwork stamped with asylum documentation and intensive monitoring requirements. His name was Rashid Karimi. He'd spent 12 years fighting for the Taliban. Now he was here because the federal government had determined he was no longer a threat, and Seattle General had a contract to treat high-security medical cases. The nurses wheeled him to the bed adjacent to Chen's, separated by a curtain partition and 18 inches of careful distance. Margaret had never been there to see him arrive. She was at home in a studio apartment on Colfax Avenue, staring at her folded hands, waiting for the phone to ring with news she already understood would come. But at 0832, when a recovery nurse named Diane was checking vitals on Chen's neighbor, Rashid's eyes snapped open with the focus of a man who'd survived war. His gaze traveled across the room to the medications cart, past the monitors, and locked directly on the woman in blue scrubs who was adjusting an IV drip with surgical precision. His entire body went rigid. When he spoke, his voice cracked with something between recognition and disbelief, and he began speaking in rapid Pashto, words tumbling over each other like he was afraid silence would steal them away. Diane froze. She didn't understand a single word, but she understood the tone. This was not delirium, this was not pain, this was the voice of someone confronting something they believed was impossible. Rashid's words came faster. Sahar Malika, the Dawn Queen, you killed Kalikov, you saved Hamid's unit, you taught us to stop bleeding, to save lives, to become healers instead of fighters. His hands shook as he tried to sit up, his wound screaming at him to stay still, but he was crying now, speaking directly to Diane while pointing at the direction the nurse had gone. That woman. Tell me her name. Tell me who she is. I know that woman. I know her hands. Diane called for a supervisor. The supervisor called security. Security called the Marine Corps liaison officer who was stationed at Seattle General for exactly this kind of classified complication. His name was Captain Marcus Holloway, and he'd been reading a magazine in the administrative office when the page went out. He moved through the hospital corridors with the kind of urgent calm that comes from knowing how to operate in chaos, and when he reached the ICU at 0847, Diane was still trying to translate fragments of Pashto while Rashid continued speaking in short bursts, his voice like gravel under boots. Holloway stepped into the room and everything shifted. He pulled out his phone and opened a secure application, something that required a biometric scan and a 6-digit code, and he scrolled through files that had been classified at the level of executive order. His face went very still. Then he looked at Rashid and back at his phone and made a single phone call. 2 minutes later, he was standing in the hallway with a printed document, and he was reading the words aloud to the charge nurse who'd appeared with questions about an authorized military presence, Captain Margaret Walsh. Silver Star for Valor during Operation Graveyard. Personally eliminated a Russian weapons broker operating in Kandahar province. Stabilized 14 casualties under fire in a forward operating base. Single-handedly, the doors to the ICU burst open with the kind of violence that comes from rage, and Dr. Pierce appeared with his face the color of old meat, his voice cutting through the ambient hospital sounds like a scalpel through skin. This is a secure facility. No military personnel without authorization. Remove yourself immediately or I'm calling hospital security. Holloway didn't stop reading. His voice didn't change pitch, didn't acknowledge Pierce's existence. Single-handedly held a field hospital against enemy combatants for 6 hours while treating civilian casualties and training local medical personnel. Recommendation for promotion to major denied per her request for operational anonymity. Record sealed by executive order, declassification pending review. Pierce's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Nothing came out. The hospital's legal team would later determine that the moment of silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. It felt longer. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song, and the heart monitors beat their steady rhythm, and somewhere in the building, a code was being called that nobody in the ICU was paying attention to. Pierce's eyes moved from Holloway to the charge nurse to the ICU doors, calculating angles, looking for exits that didn't exist. That was when the elevator doors opened at the far end of the corridor and a woman in dress uniform stepped through, 2 silver stars on each shoulder, silver eagles on her collar, for rows of ribbons including a Navy cross. Brigadier General Sarah Chen moved through the hospital like she owned it, because at this moment, in this place, she essentially did. Behind her came 3 officers in dress blues and a man in a dark suit who carried himself like someone who worked for the federal government and preferred not to specify which agency. They walked to the ICU without ceremony and without hesitation. General Chen stepped directly into the room where Rashid was lying, where James Chen was watching with oxygen tubes in his nose and dawning comprehension across his face, and she placed her hand over her heart. "At ease, soldier," she said to Rashid, and Rashid's tears flowed harder. Then she turned to the charge nurse and spoke with the precision of someone used to being obeyed immediately. "I need the decorations from Captain Walsh's personal locker. All of them. In the next 10 minutes. The charge nurse nodded and disappeared. While they waited, the man in the dark suit, who would later be identified as Dr. James Whitmore from the Pentagon's Joint Special Operations Command, began laying out documents across the ICU's break room table. Hospital staff arrived with phones, tablets, cameras. Somewhere in the building, someone was already filming. By 09:03, the decorations were being laid out like a reliquary, a bronze star with a small V for Valor, catching the fluorescent light like liquid gold. Then a purple heart, its purple ribbon the exact shade of dried blood. Another purple heart beside it. The combat medical badge. And then, nestled in a velvet box, a silver star. General Chen picked it up and held it for the cameras. There were cameras now, lots of cameras, staff members recording on phones because this was the kind of moment that didn't stay private anymore, couldn't stay private, was too big for walls and confidentiality agreements. Dr. Whitmore spoke to the gathered staff with the authority of someone reading an indictment. Captain Margaret Walsh operated under the operational codename Dawn Queen as part of a Joint Special Forces medical training unit deployed to Kandahar province from 2009 to 2015. She trained 73 local medical personnel, established 3 field hospitals, and maintained a casualty survival rate of 98.4% in a combat zone where the standard was 67%. Her records have been sealed by executive order. That seal is being lifted as of this moment. Effective immediately, her promotion to major is reinstated. Her medical credentials are fully restored. And she is being offered a position as Director of Emergency Medical Services at any military medical facility in the continental United States. The video reached 3 million views by lunch. 7 million by dinner. By midnight, it had crossed 10 million, and Dr. Robert Hastings, a man who'd survived 32 years of medical practice, 11 years in Vietnam as a Navy corpsman, for marriages, 3 heart attacks, and 1 stroke, made a phone call to his protégé from his study in Baltimore, where the television was still showing the same footage it had been showing for 8 hours straight. "Dr. Pierce," Hastings said, and his voice was the sound of ice forming on black water. "I just watched you mock a decorated combat veteran. I watched you prevent her from providing treatment that nearly killed a patient. I watched you call her attention-seeking on national television. and I watched a Pentagon official explain that she was the bravest person in that hospital and you were her saboteur." Pierce tried to interrupt. Hastings continued like Pierce wasn't there. "I taught you that medicine is about service. I taught you that the uniform you wear, the one that says doctor, not general or colonel, means you serve the patient first. What the hell happened to you?" The line went dead before Pierce could answer. By 0200, four board members had called the hospital CEO requesting Pierce's personnel file. By 0430, the state medical board had opened a formal investigation. By noon, legal had documented 12 violations of patient care standards with Pierce's signature. By 1600, Pierce was sitting in an administrator's office, being informed that he was suspended pending full review, effective immediately. His research funding contacts stopped returning emails. His colleagues avoided eye contact. The residents who'd laughed at Margaret's expense in the break room were suddenly claiming they'd always felt uncomfortable, that they'd never really participated, that they barely remembered it. Chen gave a recorded interview from his hospital bed. "He called me attention-seeking while my lung was collapsing. He locked away the equipment that could have saved my life. Captain Walsh knew what he wouldn't acknowledge. She risked everything to do what he was too small to do." The medical community turned like a flock of birds, moving in unified silence away from Pierce, away from shame by association. 6 months later, Margaret stood at the window of Seattle General's director's office, her office now, the title on the door reading Captain Margaret Walsh, Director of Emergency Medical Services, beneath which someone had already etched a small line in the wood that looked almost like a bullet point. She watched the parking lot where a medical supply van was being loaded with boxes of equipment. Dr. Pierce moved with careful deliberation, his hands shaking just slightly as he lifted each container, his jaw clenched against pain that had nothing to do with his body. The only position he'd been able to secure was with a rural clinic cooperative in Wyoming, 18 months contract, starting salary $72,000, nowhere left to climb. Behind her, in the ICU, James Chen was working through physical therapy, his lung fully recovered, the scar tissue healing with remarkable efficiency. The unit patch that Margaret had worn sewn inside her jacket lining, the faded insignia of the 3rd Battalion Special Forces Advisory Team, now hung in a frame in the hospital's main corridor, alongside her Silver Star citation and a photograph of her in combat fatigues, face young but eyes already ancient, treating casualties in a dusty compound outside Kandahar. The new residents rotating through learned from her what the old residents never had, that competence doesn't require credentials, that the quiet person in the room might be the one holding it all together, that the oath you keep matters infinitely more than the rank you claim. Chen appeared in her doorway, walking with barely a limp now, that familiar military bearing having returned to his shoulders over the past 6 months like muscle memory reasserting itself. He stood beside her at the window, watching Pierce load the final boxes into the van. Think he learned anything? Margaret's expression remained that careful blankness everyone had always known, but the corner of her mouth lifted microscopically, barely a millimeter, barely noticeable, but Chen saw it. He learned what happens when you mistake rank for respect. She turned from the window, her silver hair catching the afternoon light, and moved toward the emergency room entrance where 3 traumas were being wheeled through the bay doors. Chen called after her, "Captain." She paused at the threshold, that moment of stillness that meant she was listening. Sometimes the bravest warriors don't carry guns. They carry stethoscopes. Margaret didn't smile. She rarely smiled anymore. But her eyes, for the first time in 5 years, showed something other than careful blankness. Pride. Respect. Recognition. She nodded once, a gesture so small only someone trained to notice would have caught it, and disappeared into the organized chaos of the emergency room, finally visible, finally home, finally allowed to exist as the person she'd always been. The door swung shut behind her with a soft pneumatic hiss. Outside, Dr. Pierce loaded the final box, started the engine, and drove toward Wyoming in a vehicle that would never bring him back to Denver. Some stories end in triumph. Some end in erasure. This one ended in the restoration of what had always belonged to someone who'd never asked to be seen. Like and subscribe if you believe that hidden heroes deserve to be found. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your story? Share yours.